Hello. Oh, I thought it was a bit darker than usual. Is this better? No, that's much worse. So let's keep it in the dark, as Billy Squire might say. Anyway, welcome to the Saturday live stream. Let me know how it sounds. It looks the way it does, but hey, this is a music show, not MTV. So welcome to the live stream of Adam's Music Box this Saturday. I want to get into a few topics that are on my mind. Before we begin, I want to say rest in peace to the great Greg Kinn. They don't make them like that anymore. And he, of course, sang the breakup song, They Don't Write Them Like That Anymore. And of course, Jeopardy. And a funny story about that, when Weird Al wanted to parody Jeopardy by the Greg Kinn Band. Greg said, "Yeah, sure, I'll let you do it, but I want to be in the music video." And I just love that because musicians who are confident in their craft and who love other artists and who understand that most forms of parody are actually a high compliment, they want to participate, they want to be involved. Michael Jackson was the same way with Weird Al. So rest in peace to Greg Kinn. So today I want to get into an argument that will never end because there is no definitive answer. And I think the reason why is that the way we've been framing the question has been a bit wrong. And this is the analog versus digital debate, vinyl versus CD, vinyl versus streaming, tape versus stream. We've all heard the arguments before. And it really boils down to people that sort of stake their entire future dying on the hill of, digital, or dying on the hill of vinyl and other related analog formats. But I actually think that the truth is sadly much more time consuming and expensive if you are a collector, because it isn't quite as simple as saying, right, I'm going to have a 100% analog collection of sort of vinyl and open reel tapes, or damn it, I'm going to have a 100% digital collection, whether it's high res downloads, high res streaming, or high quality CDs. So let's look at where the problems lie. The problems with these arguments lie in the fact that every single recording and every single pressing or edition of a recording is somewhat, or in some cases, very different to others. And this means that if you really want to pose the question correctly, you want to say, what is the best mastering of any particular record, of any particular album, let's say. Singles don't really factor into this discussion as much. And once you narrow that down, well, what's the best, pressing of that particular mastering? Those are the questions that audiophiles and collectors should really be asking. And so, absent in this whole argument is the thing that really differentiates one mastering from another, one pressing from another, and that is the human element. A CD is not a human, and a vinyl record is not a human, but mastering engineers are humans. Yeah, I know that they have AI mastering, but for now, let's stick with the human ones. And so for this, you really need to take a lot of time to dig into which version, irrespective of the format of delivery, sounds the best. And I can just give a few examples. One of my favorite albums ever is Powerful People by Gino Vanelli. In the late 70s, MFSL, MoFi, Mobile Fidelity, a great label known by many names, it released a version of Powerful People. And MoFi albums are mastered very, very well because they have the best engineers and they have really good equipment from which to transfer the master tape onto the format of your choice. I believe it was the great Stan Ricker who did a lion's share of the early MoFi original master recordings. I believe that particular record was in fact done by Stan Ricker. Now, Stan Ricker is a human, and Stan Ricker happens to be a human who's very, very good at mastering records. Therefore, I care less about whether I'm having a vinyl LP or a CD or a digital streamed version of that CD in my ears, rather than I want the one that Stan Ricker did. And making matters more complex, obviously the first audiophile labels came out before the compact disc. You had your mobile fidelities, you had your Nautilus records, you had your super disc, you had your master sound, and there were other smaller ones that all seemed to come out in the late 70s and early 80s. Ironically, just on the precipice of the compact disc coming out. And so there weren't CD versions of these masterings. And the reason for that is licensing agreements. The labels that owned the master rights to the recording would go to a company like MoFi and they'll say, okay, you can press X number of records based on you mastering the tape that we will rent out to you for however long you need it, usually a couple of weeks, maybe a month, then it usually has to go back. And that was it. So there's never been an audiophile CD or other digital version of that one album that I'm talking about, Powerful People by Gino Vanelli, but there is Stan Ricker's MoFi version that I think is the best version of it, because Stan Ricker is he's sadly no longer with us, a really, really good mastering engineer. And it really cuts both ways. There are some, once MoFi became the first major audiophile label to get into audiophile CDs, there were instances of those CDs not being available on record because, of course, licensing agreements. So, for instance, Mobile Fidelity did some Procol Harum albums. They did Home on their CDs, and they did Broken Barricades on CD. Now, again, because Mobile Fidelity is an audiophile label, chances are it's going to sound better than the non-audiophile versions of any format, whether CD or LP. And I know that there are some people who will argue that audiophile versions of something aren't the end-all and be-all. Those people tend to exaggerate. It is absolutely true that there are some traditional pressings from the main record label that will sound better than a specialty pressing made from an audiophile label. But 9 times out of 10, the audiophile label is going to sound better because they make the effort of hiring the best mastering engineers who will typically be using the best mastering equipment, and the pressings themselves will be done pardon me, on higher quality vinyl, and the CDs will simply have more quality control. So for those reasons, it is frankly true that 9 times out of 10, your audiophile pressing, digital or analog, in terms of the final delivery format, is going to be better than the non-audiophile version. And so I just gave you a few examples, and there's hundreds, but I gave you a few examples off the top of my head of why a Gino Vanelli Powerful People MoFi record mastered by Stan Ricker will sound better than any other LP or CD version or streamed version of that album. And inversely, the MoFi versions of Procol Harum's Home and Procol Harum's Broken Barricades are generally going to sound better than any other CD or LP versions. You're following the mastering engineer first and foremost, and it generally goes without saying that when you've got a high quality mastering engineer working for an audiophile label, that is going to be the best version of that recording, irrespective of the delivery format. Pause for water. Now then, let's make things even more complicated. What happens when you have a great mastering engineer working with subpar sources and subpar equipment? Well, we can test this. The early compact discs generally didn't sound as good as many of the vinyl records available in the early 80s. And there were 2 main reasons for this. One reason was digital to analog converters weren't as good as they later became. And the other reason is that in the very early days, a lot of mastering engineers didn't really know their way around the digital world. They were mastering for CD using the techniques of the RIAA curve that had to be employed on a vinyl record. With the CD, you have no such limitations. And yet they were making CDs sound like records, which made them sound worse than records in many cases. But there was one particular engineer who was there relatively early on in the days of the compact disc, and he was called Barry Diamond. He's still around, one of the best engineers of all time. And he was working with the 1980s digital to analog converters, and most of the time he didn't even have access to master tapes. Sometimes he did, but he admits sometimes they gave him second gen tapes, or they would give him U-matic copies of the master tape. So the initial copy of the tape wasn't even something he, as the mastering engineer, was in charge of, which put him at somewhat of a disadvantage. And guess what? His CDs sound amazing. And why? Because Barry Diamond, like Stan Ricker, is a human. He's not a piece of vinyl or a piece of glass or a piece of metal or a cloud server somewhere. He's a human. And as such, he did a really good job, often at a great disadvantage in terms of what he had access to. And you can listen. He did the Led Zeppelin first pressings of their CDs. He did the first American version of Genesis, A Trick of the Tail, and Abacab and Duke, all Genesis albums. He did the Bob Marley albums on CD for the US market. They sound amazing. The Eagles for the US market. I think he did a number of Bad Company. I think he did a number of Foreigner of some of these first editions on CD. He did the first editions of most albums from Yes. And all of these on these first editions of the CDs, not only do they sound good, they sound better than later editions of the CDs, because while digital analog converters got better, some of the humans involved sadly weren't as good as Barry Diamond at mastering. And you also have the human element, which can go both ways. In the late 90s into the early 2000s, they had something called the Loudness Wars, where they wanted CDs to sound as loud as possible. Why? So they'd impress people on generally lower quality playback systems like car stereos. Don't get me wrong, there's some really good car stereos, but your average car stereo is obviously going to be much worse than your $50,000 hi-fi system that you may have at home, or maybe you don't. But the point is, that was the loudness war. So even as digital analog converters got better, humans made a decision. This was usually coming from the labels, not the mastering engineers, to make the albums just brick walled and compressed so they sound harsh and loud, no dynamic range, no detail, no soundstage. And so there's an example of a CD made with less high quality analog to digital converters with Barry Diamond in the mid 80s, sounding better than something made in, let's say, 2002, a mastering of that same album. Again, the human factor is in play. And then we have things like the great classical records from the classical labels that were audiophile in all but name. The term didn't really exist in the 50s and early 60s, but your first pressing Decca SXLs in Europe, or your Bluebacks, your London Bluebacks in the US, same pressings, slightly different jackets, your RCA Living Stereos, your Mercury Living Presence. Those LPs sound great, but with slightly more sophisticated cutting technologies, one could make an argument that the reissues of these great albums by Classic Records and later by Analog Productions, which acquired Classic Records, well, what's better, the first pressing or the ones done with slightly better analog equipment? Because it isn't only digital equipment, which at the upper end improves over the years, the analog equipment arguably does as well. And well, what would be better, a flat transfer of a tape to a CD of one of the great Decca or RCA Living Stereo or Mercury Living Presence albums, or a vinyl record? Because vinyl records do have limitations in terms of things like dynamic range that CDs generally don't. I mean, every format has a limitation, but CDs, at least in theory, have much broader dynamic range. And this leads me to the ultimate conclusion that you really have to go by the mastering engineer. When something's done at the same time in the same place, you can afford to be a bit more discriminating based on format. For instance, tapes have much better dynamic range and much less distortion than vinyl. So if you've got let's say, a Revox or an Ampex or a TIAC or a Technics or an Akai reel-to-reel tape player, you can buy some of the tapes, the open reel tapes that record labels were pressing in the, well, pressing's not the right word for tape, but, they were releasing in the 50s, 60s, into the 70s, and in some rare cases into the 80s. And those will not always, but generally sound even even better than the good LPs of that era. Also much more rare because open reel tape, aka reel-to-reel tape, those were the hi-fi formats, the sort of super audiophile special edition with all the bells and whistles of the 50s and 60s. And so then we get into the last sort of 10 or 15 years when we have a better way to A/B this. And the reason is it's really only been in the last 10 to 15 years where audiophile labels will tend to release an LP and an SACD, a super high quality digital format of the same album, either done by the same mastering engineer, as is the case on most analog productions releases, or done by engineers working closely together and really going for a similar, if not the same sound. And for that, I refer to the recent developments at MoFi, where the LPs and the SACDs are mastered by different individuals, but that work close together, and the end result is a very similar sound on the MoFi SACDs and LPs. Because as I said, to recap, you didn't have CDs when the first specialty audiophile LP labels came out. And when the first audiophile label CDs came out, there were very rarely versions of them on LP. I do have to say that in the 90s, a number of Anadisc, which was a series that MoFi did, they had CD counterparts. And you can really see that they tend to sound similar. And the same is true, I think, with the modern MoFis. And if you've got an Analog Productions SACD or LP, those are almost always mastered by the same human, whether it's Bernie Grunman or Ryan K. Smith or Chris Bellman, etc. They've got others. Kevin Gray does a lot of them too. And if you were to really, really try to figure out what's better between the LP and the CD, you'd have to have an A/B comparison environment that not only has the same mastering engineer working with similar tools along the chain of along that mastering chain, only veering off when you have the cutting process for the LP and the transfer process for the digital. You have to have all of that as similar as possible. And then it comes down to things like, well, do you have a better stylus or turntable? In other words, is the quality of your analog playback better than the quality of your digital playback? Difficult to A/B because you're working with different animals. And when all is said and done, if the equipment is top of the range, if you've got, let's say, an SACD from Analog Productions from the original master tape done by Bernie Grunman versus an LP, it's going to sound pretty similar, because the differences between CD and LP, while they are great, when all else is considered and both of them are done with the utmost attention to detail in terms of quality, control, in terms of the artistry of the mastering engineer, you're not going to be able to tell that big of a difference. And so I say, because most albums don't have that luxury of the same engineer doing it at the same time, the way that recent Analog Productions masterings do, you're really, if you really want to go down this rabbit hole of being an audiophile, you are going to have to invest a lot of money into analog equipment and digital equipment in order to get the most bang for your buck. Now, I've had a theory that really lawyers are to blame for all of this. And to get even more specific, the record labels who hire those lawyers are to blame for all of this, because in a perfect world, it would be very easy to take the analog parts from an original MoFi LP release and digitize them and put them on a streaming service, and then have multiple other masterings. You can have, let's say, the mastering that MoFi did of Procol Harum's Procol Barricades on CD versus other masterings. Let the platforms, your Spotify's, well, probably not that because it's not a hi-fi platform, but let your Tidals, your Cobuzzes, your Apples, let them have multiple pressings of the multiple masterings of the same album. Let the user compare and take those Nautilus audiophile LPs from the late 70s, early 80s, your MoFis, your master sounds, your super discs, digitize them. It's very possible to do. Put them on the streaming services. And the only thing, there's nothing technological making that difficult. What is making it difficult are the licensing agreements going back 40 years in some cases that are prohibiting MoFi from, let's say, going up to Tidal and saying, look, why don't we digitize these analog parts that we use to make these great original master recordings, but uh, done by mastering engineers like the late great Stan Ricker? Why don't we put it on Tidal and let people see which mastering they prefer, taking the variations of the physical delivery format out of the equation? It would be really fun. It would be niche, but I think that there are enough people who already pay a lot to Tidal, who might pay an extra $5 a month, to have this added level of granularity, this added level of variety to the audiophile experience. And it could only create more buzz around these old recordings that not a lot of youngsters are listening to. So, record labels and your high priced lawyers, talk to these audiophile labels, create licensing agreements fit for the 21st century, allow these long out of print masterings by the greats like Stan Ricker or Doug Sachs, two of the greats that are no longer with us. Let them be re released in a digitized format, and let's hear it out. And let's prove once and for all that it's the individuals, the humans involved, that separate audiophile from a more middle of the road recording, even more so than the equipment. The equipment is super important, but as the Berry Diamond reference made clear, a good engineer using less than ideal equipment, and even with less than ideal access to the master tape, is able to work wonders. I also want to talk about some music rather than music delivery. And I had Santana on my mind because, interestingly, MoFi is re releasing their version of Love, Devotion, Surrender, which was a wonderful collaboration between Santana, Carlos Santana, that is, and John McLaughlin. And it's such a great album, such great drumming. You've got Billy Cobham on there, really great stuff. Some people say it's chaotic. I say it's guitar fusion bliss. It's definitely one of the less accessible projects that Carlos Santana worked on, where one could make an argument. Well, I've had this discussion before. What is the most accessible of all fusion bands? And there isn't any one answer. I said that War, for instance, in their unique blend of jazz, Latino music from LA, rock, funk, R&B, they were among one of the most accessible fusion bands, and they have the hits to prove it. Things like Lowrider, Why Can't We Be Friends, Everyday Music. But Santana had even more hits, and they were definitely a jazz fusion band. Santana himself, he admires John Coltrane. He's collaborated with the likes of John McLaughlin. And one thing that I think is overlooked is just how wide and deep the Santana discography is. Most people have a tendency to focus on the first handful of albums by that classic lineup. The people like Michael Shreve on the drums, Greg Rowley on vocals and keyboards, who would later go on to form Journey. And then later, still in that classic period, you have the great Caravanserai album from 1972, arguably Santana's finest hour in terms of pure jazz fusion. And you even have other people from Journey. You have Neil Schon on guitar. Let us not forget that there would be no Journey if there wasn't a Santana. But once members of this original lineup dropped off, there were still some wonderful albums that Santana did. Barboletta from 1974 is a favorite. He was still making hits even after this original lineup, because on the 76 album Amigos, you had one of the top instrumental hits of all of the 70s, Europa, Earth's Cry, Heaven's Smile, and some wonderful musicians on there. Tom Coster playing the keyboards there, David Brown on guitar. Wonderful stuff. And then, of course, there was Inner Secrets from 78, which actually sold quite well. Open Invitation, a great song showing off the more rocky side of Santana. When you go into the 80s, you have Alex Litterwood, you have people like the great Alan Pasqua, who had performed on Tony Williams' wonderful album Believe It from 75. And so when we're talking about Santana, there is a whole wide range of material between that original lineup with Greg Raleigh and Michael Shreve, the people who did Evil Ways, Oye Como Va, Samba Party, Black Magic Woman, the wonderful cover of the Peter Green Fleetwood Mac song. But there's so much between that and the sort of huge explosive revival of Santana that we saw in 1999 with the release of Supernatural, where he collaborated with many of the best pop musicians of the day. Santana never really stopped, and his quality was always really, really good. And I honestly think that the 70s and early 80s period, which tends to be the most forgotten period of Santana's career, has some of his very best stuff, some of his most fusiony stuff, but there's also some of his most pop-oriented stuff sort of thrown in there. Luckily, all of Santana's discography is widely available on all of your major music streaming platforms. So I think one of the, in addition to sort of wanting to look at the more rare bands and artists out there, I think one of the cool things that streaming has allowed the average listener to do is dig into the deeper back catalog of artists, the stuff that didn't sell, treble platinum and diamond and all that. And it allows them to take that stuff as seriously as the stuff that really sold big. And that, again, sort of going back to this audio thing, one of the things that I really love about streaming is that it could do some things that record stores could not. We all hear about why record stores were so important, and they were. There was something fun about them. You got to dig through cases of records, irrespective of categorization, no algorithm trying to predict what you like. You would run into people at these record stores, such enlightened and inspired people who could make recommendations based on their experience and tell their truth about music to you. And that is kind of lost in this day and age. But there is something that we've gained. We always talk about what we lost, but why not talk about what we've gained? And what we've gained is that without having to leave your room or without having to even be in any location, because you've got it now on phones, obviously, you have access to almost every recording ever made. Not every pressing, unfortunately, to go back to what we were saying earlier, but at least one version, one pressing, one mastering of almost everything ever made. And that is extraordinary, especially for people who don't live in big cities or for people who live in countries that never had access the first time around to these great records for whatever reason. And now they do. So streaming is something where, let's say, if you came to me as someone who grew up around record shops and record shops alone and said, hey, man, one day there's going to be this futuristic format where on your freaking phone, you'll be able to just type in the name of any album, any song, any artist in the classical world, any conductor, any orchestra, and have that recording. And it's for one flat fee. You won't need to worry about, oh, I found a rare pressing of something, but it's scratched to hell. It's not near mint like the guy told me it was. I would have said, mind is officially blown. And so there are so many advantages to streaming that we don't talk about enough. We're so quick to focus on the downsides, and there are many, not least the way that artists are compensated. But for the listener, there are so many benefits. And so I'm thinking, do what I did, dig into Santana's back catalog, stuff that you probably, if you have the original records, which I have, but you haven't dug into them for ages, dig into them on Spotify now. And I've also been listening to a lot of Les McCann. Now, Les McCann is one of the great musicians in the history of jazz. Wonderful pianist, wonderful at electronic instruments like keyboard based synthesizers, great vocalist, wonderful, wonderful songwriter. You can't say enough about him. I did a video on my favorite pianists of all time, which I haven't really released yet. I'm sort of waiting for a good moment. Maybe it's Piano Appreciation Day one day. But he's on that list. And he's absolutely superlative. He was never a favorite of the critics. And this is because of snobbery. A lot of critics prefer things that are overtly avant-garde, what the Russians would call formalistic, rather than stuff that has roots in the soul and gospel origins of Les McCann. But not only is that snobby, but it's musically incorrect because there would be no blues, there would be no jazz, there would be no funk, no rock and roll, arguably no Western pop music as we know it, if not for gospel music. And Les McCann's jazz and Les McCann's spiritual music and Les McCann's politicized music, because he was very much an advocate for the liberation of his people, that was all rooted in gospel, and that's why it was accessible. In fact, you could argue that the root of all Western European, Central European, and much Southern European music is liturgical in its basis, because European classical music grew out of the music of the Catholic Church, and later, for example, in the era of Bach, in Protestant churches. Bach was a devout Lutheran. And by definition, liturgical music needs to be one part ethereal and above the surface, floating in the heavens, but on the other hand it needs to be accessible, because no church wants to repel parishioners. The music is used to enhance the faithful devotion, whether and this is true whether it's a classical mass in the Catholic tradition. It's true whether it's Anton Bruckner, a secular musician, but all of his music was inspired by his Catholicism. It's true in Les McCann, where his funk, his soul, his danceable music, his music where he's singing about his people, all of that has its essence in the gospel music that he grew up in. And so Les McCann is one of the best of all time, and don't let any snobby critic tell you otherwise. Luckily, not all, but most of his truly great albums are on Spotify. And I think that he really hit his stride in the late 60s and the 70s. I would have to say that my two favorite albums from Les are Another Beginning from 1974 and Layers from 73. Don't sleep on Hustle to Survive. Great synthesizer stuff from 1975. The next year he did River High, River Low. Second Movement from 71. A wonderful collaboration he did with Eddie Harris, another great pioneer of what they called soul jazz, but what's really just another form of jazz's growth, of jazz's fusion. Because like John McLaughlin said, all music is really fusion. It's all being inspired by something else. And as music evolves, it all tends to incorporate something else. So definitely go to your Spotify's, your titles, wherever you go to hear great music, and listen to some Les McCann, because less is more. And on that, I'll give you the daily admonition to like, subscribe, and share. It's not easy to grow a YouTube channel because the algorithms tend to favor those who are already famous, much like the record industry used to do. So sharing and liking and subscribing and pushing the notification bell is also quite important as I try to grow and expand and make more sophisticated this channel. And for those asking why I don't play the music on this channel, it's because as I'm trying to grow the channel, I don't want to be forcibly demonetized or censored. And that does happen when an early channel does that. When you have a bit more maturity on your channel, they'll usually not axe your channel, but they'll demonetize you. They might remove videos. It's a very draconian system. And I've said before that right now, the way that copyright works is you have to opt in. You have to get permission one way or another through a licensing agreement, through explicit consent. I think we need to change all that and create an opt-out system where the default is that you have consent to play music, especially if you're doing it covered by fair use, as commentary and criticism is covered by fair use. But the big tech companies are so afraid of the lawyers working for the record labels and of Don Henley that they don't even allow for monetization or even free expression through fair use. So we need to change and modernize copyright and say that it should be an opt-out system where the default position in law is that you should be able to utilize music in your videos, in your TikToks, in your commentaries, in your whatever content you have. And the only rule is that a percentage of the profit, if there is any, should go to the songwriter, to the composer. I think that is totally fair. It is win-win, and it gives the opt-out option. So if someone wants to say, Even if I'm making money from it, I don't want you dancing to my song on TikTok. Fine, they'll dance to someone else's song who's a bit more living in the 21st century. Musicians make money. Well, the composers certainly, were oftentimes the performers as well. They make money. Content creators are allowed to do what they want to do. Everyone wins. Switch it from an opt-in to an opt-out system. That is the way forward, music industry. Again, like, subscribe. We will see you next time. Take care.